it's never probably as nice as it seems to other people, or as bad. Other times an album isn't making it, but you get some good things from every project you do.
Michael McDonald's voice defined an era, soulful, smooth, unforgettable. As a Doobie Brother, he reshaped rock with a sound that blurred the lines between pop, R&B, and jazz, carrying the band into new territory and winning Grammys along the way. But behind the velvet tones and platinum records were rifts, rivalries, and secrets that never made the liner notes. At the center was Jeff Baxter, bandmate, guitar virtuoso, and the spark of both brilliance and conflict. For decades, McDonald stayed silent, leaving fans to wonder what really happened behind the curtain. But now, at 73, he finally speaks. And what he admits about Jeff Baxter doesn't just revisit old band drama. It reframes their legacy completely. What truth did McDonald finally reveal that left fans stunned? Stay with us as we find out. Michael McDonald didn't simply enter the Doobie Brothers. He arrived like a storm disguised in velvet, carrying with him both salvation and disruption. By the mid-1970s, the band was already an established powerhouse of American rock, known for their impeccable harmonies, their layered guitar riffs, and their road-tested energy that made them one of the most consistent touring acts in the country. They had the grit, the groove, and the goodwill of audiences everywhere. But beneath that success, cracks were forming. Years of relentless touring schedules, endless studio sessions, and the unrelenting pressure to keep producing hits were beginning to take their toll. The band was burning out, and the fire that had carried them through the early decade was flickering. They were at a crossroads: keep grinding forward on fumes, or risk falling into irrelevance in a rapidly shifting musical landscape. That was the moment Michael McDonald stepped into the spotlight. A St. Louis native with a voice steeped in gospel and soul. He wasn't just another musician joining the lineup, he was a game changer. McDonald's musical DNA carried something the Doobie Brothers had never fully embraced before: an unmistakable blend of smooth baritone warmth and emotive power that reached into the listener's chest and refused to let go. His sound wasn't built for the smoky roadhouses of their earlier days. It was built for arenas, for radio airplay, and for a future where sophistication would matter as much as swagger. From the first time he opened his mouth behind the mic, the Doobie Brothers were transformed. His debut contributions, most notably the title track of "Takin' It to the Streets," didn't just expand their catalog, they redefined it. Gone was some of the dusty road grit of their earlier records, replaced with sleek polish, jazzy undertones, and R&B influences that gave the band an entirely new identity. Later, songs like "What a Fool Believes," co-written with Kenny Loggins, would cement that transformation. This was not the same Doobie Brothers who had carved their name with songs like "China Grove" or "Listen to the Music." This was a group that had evolved and in many ways had been reborn under the velvet thunder of McDonald's voice. The results spoke for themselves. The public adored it, critics celebrated it, and the record sales soared higher than ever. Suddenly, the Doobie Brothers weren't just a rock band. They were crossover stars, sitting comfortably at the intersection of pop, rock, and soul. They were on the radio constantly, and their albums moved by the millions. To the outside world, it was triumph, a second win that placed the band at the very top of the music world. But inside, the reinvention carried consequences. Not everyone in the band welcomed the transformation. Founding members, those who had built the Doobie Brothers' foundation on rawer, guitar-driven rock, struggled with the idea that their essence was being replaced. What had started as a collective band was increasingly being shaped around the power of one man's voice. For some, McDonald's arrival felt less like a rejuvenation and more like an invasion. Was this still the Doobie Brothers? Or had they become Michael McDonald's backing band? The tension was never fully resolved. Whispers of discord trailed them from city to city, shadowing their tours and complicating their victories. Yet on stage and on the records, the music never faltered. McDonald had become both the band's savior and its disruptor. The paradox at the heart of their late 70s legacy. He was the reason they remained relevant, the reason they filled arenas, and the reason their sound endured beyond a single era. But he was also the catalyst for rivalries that quietly simmered behind the scenes, rivalries that would eventually grow into fractures. And at the very center of those rivalries stood one man, guitarist Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, a figure whose clash with McDonald would become one of the most defining and most divisive chapters in Doobie Brothers history. By the time Michael McDonald took command of the microphone, the Doobie Brothers weren't merely a band anymore, they were an institution, a brand with weight and recognition that stretched across the country and beyond. Their music poured out of radios, their albums stacked in record shops, and their tours drew massive crowds night after night. They had built the kind of career that only a handful of groups ever truly achieved. Platinum records, chart-topping singles, and the kind of name recognition that guaranteed sold-out shows. But with great success comes an even greater burden. The band was no longer just a family of musicians playing for the love of it. They were a machine, and the pressure to keep that machine running was immense. Underneath the glow of stardom, fractures were beginning to spread like hairline cracks across glass. Small at first, but impossible to ignore. The first and most obvious fracture was musical. The Doobie Brothers had built their reputation on a specific sound, one rooted in guitar-driven rock, raw harmonies, and a gritty, free-flowing energy that gave their early records a sense of authenticity. Fans loved that earthiness, that sense that the music came from the open road and the hard miles of life. But McDonald's arrival shifted everything. His voice, silky, soulful, and commanding, naturally pulled the band toward a different center of gravity. Suddenly, keyboards weren't just an accent. They were the backbone. Soul-inspired arrangements began to dominate, smoothing out the edges of the band's rock and roll grit. To many fans and critics, this shift was evolution, proof that the Doobie Brothers weren't afraid to grow, adapt, and step into a new era. But to others, especially some within the band itself, it felt like a betrayal, a surrender of their roots to something sleeker, shinier, and less authentic. The arguments that followed weren't loud or explosive. There were no dramatic fistfights or screaming matches that tabloids could exploit. Instead, the discord simmered beneath the surface, invisible to fans but palpable to anyone in the rehearsal room or the studio. Where once guitarists thrived in sprawling jam sessions, feeding off one another's energy and creating sparks of spontaneity, they now found themselves hemmed in by charts, arrangements, and McDonald's meticulous direction. The music was tighter, more disciplined, and undeniably professional. But it came at the expense of that wild, untamed spirit that had once defined the Doobies. Behind closed doors, fault lines became clear. Some members, especially those weary of the endless grind and conscious of shifting tastes in the music industry, saw McDonald as a lifeline. To them, he was the man who had saved the band from fading into obscurity, the voice who carried them through a changing era and kept them commercially relevant when so many other 70s acts were being swept aside. His presence, they argued, was a gift, and the price of adaptation was worth paying. But others didn't see it that way. To them, McDonald was less a savior and more a usurper, an outsider whose undeniable talent came with an equally undeniable shadow. His golden voice drew the spotlight. His songwriting defined the hits, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Doobie Brothers stopped being a band of equals. They were becoming, in the eyes of some, Michael McDonald and company. That resentment, whispered in dressing rooms and carried quietly in recording sessions, began to fester. And in this growing divide, one figure loomed especially large: Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, a guitarist with unmatched technical skill, a restless innovator, and an eccentric visionary with his own unshakable opinions. Baxter wasn't one to sit idly by as the band's identity shifted beneath him. He had joined the Doobies to be part of a rock outfit, fueled by creativity, not to serve as a background player in McDonald's polished, keyboard-driven vision. Baxter saw things differently, and he wasn't afraid to make those differences known. What followed wasn't an open war, but a cold one, subtle, sharp, and strategic. The tensions between Baxter and McDonald didn't explode in front of audiences. Instead, they simmered quietly, shaping decisions, influencing alliances, and leaving their mark on the band's late 70s legacy. For fans, the music was seamless. For the band, it was the beginning of one of the quietest yet most defining feuds in rock history. Jeff Baxter was no ordinary guitarist. On stage and off, he was a spectacle, nicknamed Skunk for his wild personality, his bushy hair, and his refusal to blend into the background. He wasn't just another band member strumming along, he was a showman with flair, a technician with precision, and, in many ways, a mad scientist with a guitar in his hands. His contributions to the Doobie Brothers extended far beyond riffs and solos. Baxter was an architect of their evolving sound, a restless force that pushed them to experiment, stretch boundaries, and embrace musical ideas others wouldn't even dare to consider. Before ever plugging in with the Doobies, Baxter had already proven his chops in one of the most demanding musical environments of the era: Steely Dan. That experience left an indelible mark on him. Steely Dan was notorious for their perfectionism, their studio sessions infamous for endless takes and microscopic attention to detail. Baxter came out of that world sharper than ever, carrying with him not only the discipline of precision playing, but also a philosophical hunger to keep asking, what if? What if a song bent just a little more toward jazz? What if rock could borrow from Latin rhythms? Or if funk grooves could be woven into a mainstream hit? He wasn't satisfied with simply playing music. He studied it, dissected it, and reassembled it in ways that made him seem like both scholar and inventor. To many, Jeff Baxter was nothing short of a genius. But genius has its shadows. It doesn't always fit neatly into the machinery of a group dynamic. While McDonald thrived on structure, layered arrangements, carefully crafted harmonies, and soulful melodies polished to perfection, Baxter lived for unpredictability. He wanted edge, risk, and the raw crackle of guitar-driven experimentation. Their personalities collided as much as their philosophies. McDonald radiated calm control, a steady hand guiding the band toward a polished future. Baxter radiated chaos and curiosity, a spark constantly looking for kindling. From the outside looking in, none of this tension was visible. Fans only saw results. The Doobie Brothers charting hit after hit, their concerts delivered with flawless execution, their albums gleaming with the sheen of professional polish. But inside rehearsal rooms and recording studios, things were different. Those who were there recall moments where Baxter would halt a session to challenge an arrangement, arguing that McDonald's direction was sanding down the band's rough edges until there was nothing left of the fire that had once fueled them. McDonald, ever composed, would quietly counter with arrangements so tight, so locked into place, that they left little room for rebellion or improvisation. It wasn't anger that divided them, it was philosophy. At the heart of their quiet feud was a single unanswered question. What was the soul of the Doobie Brothers? Were they the freewheeling, rough-cut rockers who had once launched themselves into stardom on guitar jams and raw harmonies? Or were they now the polished, soulful ensemble that filled arenas with slick sophistication and radio-friendly hooks? The band couldn't be both forever. At some point, the balance would tip. For Jeff Baxter, this was never just about music. It was about identity. He had poured himself into the Doobies, shaping their sound during pivotal years, only to watch as McDonald's arrival shifted the spotlight and redefined everything the band represented. The more McDonald's silky baritone came to define the Doobie Brothers, the more Baxter felt himself standing at the margins of a group he had once helped drive forward. It was like watching his own creation morph into something unrecognizable, something he hadn't signed up for. Fans never glimpsed any of this turmoil. To them, the Doobie Brothers remained seamless. The concerts were immaculate, the records unstoppable, and the success undeniable. Yet behind the stage lights, and within the hushed walls of studios, the rivalry between Jeff "Skunk" Baxter and Michael McDonald brewed in silence. It was a battle of ideals, a clash of visions, and perhaps one of the quietest yet most consequential rivalries in rock history. Though no one declared it openly, the truth simmered just beneath the surface. Jeff Baxter and Michael McDonald were rivals in everything but name. To the public eye, the Doobie Brothers looked unstoppable. Every tour was a victory lap, with arenas packed to the rafters by fans who knew every lyric, every harmony, every groove. Their albums seemed destined for platinum the moment they hit the shelves, and at the center of this dazzling success stood Michael McDonald, his rich baritone voice dominating the airwaves. Every note he sang seemed to glide effortlessly onto radio playlists across the nation. For fans, it was the golden age of the Doobie Brothers, an era where the music never faltered, the success never slowed, and the band seemed untouchable. But that glossy exterior concealed a truth only the insiders could see. Beneath the sheen of platinum records and glowing reviews, a quiet storm was brewing within the group. It was not the kind of feud that spilled onto tabloids or generated sensational headlines. There were no broken guitars smashed in rage, no fists thrown backstage, no walkouts in the middle of concerts. Instead, it was subtler, far quieter, a silent but unrelenting clash of vision between two titans, Michael McDonald and Jeff "Skunk" Baxter. On one side was Baxter, the restless innovator, the guitarist whose wild energy had shaped so much of the Doobies' earlier sound. He was the defender of their roots, a man who wanted to keep the edge sharp and the grit intact. To him, the band's heart lived in its guitar-driven soul, its raw harmonies, its road-born swagger. That was the Doobie Brothers he had joined, the Doobie Brothers fans first fell in love with. To watch that identity fade into polish and smoothness felt, to Baxter, like watching the soul of the group slip away. On the other side stood McDonald, equally brilliant, but with a different compass. He leaned toward refinement, structure, and sophistication. He saw the possibilities in soul-inspired melodies, the power in disciplined arrangements, the universality of R&B polish that could reach audiences far beyond the rock circuit. And the numbers were on his side. His vision was translating into chart-topping singles, sold-out tours, and radio dominance. For McDonald, the future was clear. Evolution wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Both directions were valid. Both were brilliant. But when two geniuses collide, even the smallest disagreements can echo like earthquakes. The conflict between Baxter and McDonald wasn't about ego in the traditional sense. It was about philosophy, about the very soul of the band. And that philosophical divide seeped into everything. Rehearsals that felt tense, recording sessions that dragged longer than necessary, and decisions about the band's future that seemed to carry invisible weight. Other members found themselves caught in the middle, often without wanting to choose sides. Some gravitated toward Baxter, sharing his longing for the rougher, freer spirit of the early days. Others leaned toward McDonald, grateful for the lifeline he had thrown the band during a time when so many of their contemporaries were fading into obscurity. The band was still one unit on stage, but behind the curtain, loyalties were divided. It was a question never spoken aloud, but always present. Was the Doobie Brothers' future tied to Jeff Baxter's restless experimentation, or to Michael McDonald's velvet tones that sold records by the millions? That unspoken question shaped every decision the Doobie Brothers made in those years. Their legacy wasn't defined solely by the music they created. It was defined by the tension that fueled it. The band's hits weren't just songs. They were compromises, uneasy truces disguised as harmony. Fans adored the sound, pouring into arenas and buying albums in droves, but only those on the inside knew the cost. Every soaring chorus carried the weight of disagreement. Every flawless performance masked the reality that the brotherhood had fractured. By the late 70s, the Doobie Brothers were no longer the united band their name suggested. They were a house divided, split not by scandal or betrayal, but by vision and philosophy. And in the silence between McDonald and Baxter, in the looks exchanged during rehearsals, in the subtle tension felt during recording sessions, was a truth louder than any shouted argument could ever be. The Doobie Brothers were no longer one family. They were two competing worlds, bound together only by success. And the fuse had already been lit. Behind the roar of the crowd, backstage was another story. Musicians often say the hardest part of fame isn't the spotlight. It's what happens once the curtain falls. For the Doobie Brothers, the backstage became the arena where egos clashed, and unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Jeff Baxter, ever the maverick, pushed boundaries in both music and personality. He was bold, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge decisions he didn't agree with. His guitar solos weren't just performances, they were declarations, daring anyone to ignore his vision of what the Doobie Brothers could be. McDonald, on the other hand, embodied restraint. His calm demeanor masked an iron will. He didn't raise his voice, but his quiet authority carried weight. Once McDonald laid down a keyboard riff or a vocal line, it became the centerpiece, whether the rest of the band liked it or not. The tension between them became unavoidable. Studio sessions turned into long nights of subtle battles. Baxter insisting on improvisation, McDonald insisting on control. At times, other bandmates tried to mediate, but the underlying conflict wasn't one that could be smoothed over with compromise. It was a battle for the soul of the Doobie Brothers. And while the audience only saw harmony, the band was slowly fracturing. Backstage conversations were peppered with sighs, rolled eyes, and silent retreats. A rift had formed, one that no amount of applause could heal. Baxter's frustration grew as McDonald's influence tightened its grip on the band's sound. To him, the Doobies were slipping away from their roots. To McDonald, he was saving them from irrelevance. Those backstage battles were never broadcast to the public, but they left scars on the group, scars that no hit single could erase. Every platinum plaque tells a story, but not every story is the one fans think they know. For the Doobie Brothers, the hits of the McDonald era weren't just triumphs. They were compromises, victories laced with bitterness. Each song carried within it the weight of choices made behind closed doors, the tension of a band caught between past and future. Take What a Fool Believes, for instance. To the world, it was a masterpiece, a song that earned Grammys and became an anthem of its time. But behind the recording lay endless debates, arrangements dissected, parts questioned, egos bruised. Baxter, brilliant but restless, pushed for experimentation that never made the final cut. McDonald, determined to shape the song his way, pushed back with equal force. The result? A hit that changed music history, but also deepened the divide between two men who could no longer see eye to eye. The same pattern played out across albums. Each chart-topping single masked the reality of musicians fighting to be heard, of ideas silenced for the sake of cohesion. The public celebrated platinum sales, but to the band, those shiny records were also reminders of what had been lost. These weren't stories that made it into interviews or press releases. They were whispered among insiders, tucked away in the margins of rock history. But to the men living them, they were unforgettable. The secrets buried in those platinum records told a darker tale than any liner notes could reveal. And years later, when Michael McDonald finally broke his silence, those buried truths resurfaced. Because sometimes, the real story isn't the one written on the charts. It's the one hidden in the shadows of success. In the early days, there was camaraderie. The Doobie Brothers weren't just a band. They were a family forged on the road. Nights spent crammed in vans and days spent chasing the next stage. Michael McDonald and Jeff Baxter had moments of genuine friendship, trading ideas, laughing in studios, and finding common ground in their shared passion for pushing musical boundaries. But like many friendships in the crucible of fame, theirs didn't survive the pressures of success. The cracks widened slowly. At first, it was small disagreements, McDonald suggesting a smoother arrangement, while Baxter pushed for a grittier riff. But over time, those creative clashes began to feel personal. Each saw in the other not just a colleague, but a rival encroaching on their vision. To Baxter, McDonald's rise within the band felt like an eclipse. To McDonald, Baxter's unpredictability threatened the cohesion he believed was essential to survival. The result was a quiet war. No dramatic explosions, no walkouts in front of cameras, just a constant tension humming beneath every rehearsal, every concert, every recording session. Words unspoken carried as much weight as arguments shouted. Baxter began to distance himself, throwing himself into side projects and new ideas, while McDonald cemented his place as the voice of the Doobie Brothers' new era. By the time fans noticed the shift in sound, the friendship had already fractured. On stage, they still stood side by side, delivering flawless performances that masked the truth. But backstage, the warmth was gone. The smiles were professional. The conversations clipped. What once had been collaboration had become competition. And competition had curdled into a war neither man would openly acknowledge, but both felt deeply. Every band has its breaking point, and for Michael McDonald, that moment came when the weight of conflict became unbearable. Success should have felt like triumph, but instead, it felt like a burden. The very songs that made him a star were also the ones that sparked resentment among his bandmates, and Jeff Baxter's constant pushback only amplified the sense that McDonald was fighting not just for music, but for his place in the Doobie Brothers. There was a night, insiders later whispered, when McDonald seriously considered walking away. The arguments had piled too high, the tension stretched too thin. For a man known for his calm demeanor, the toll was visible. Weariness etched into his voice, frustration buried behind polite smiles. The endless push and pull with Baxter, the unspoken accusations from other members, and the sense that the band was tearing itself apart made him question whether it was worth continuing. Fans would never have guessed. On stage, McDonald gave them everything. His rich voice soaring above the crowd, his presence commanding the spotlight. But once the curtain fell, the doubts crept back in. Was he leading the Doobie Brothers to greater heights, or dragging them into battles they couldn't escape? The thought of leaving wasn't fleeting. It was real. At one point, McDonald reportedly told those close to him that he couldn't take much more. That the infighting and resentment were choking the joy out of music itself. But he stayed, at least for a while. Maybe it was loyalty, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the belief that the music was bigger than the battles. Still, that moment of near departure reveals just how close the Doobie Brothers came to losing the voice that defined their greatest hits. For decades, Michael McDonald held his tongue. He let the music speak, allowed the narrative of the Doobie Brothers to be written by fans, critics, and historians. But silence doesn't erase the past. It only delays its reckoning. And after nearly half a century, McDonald finally chose to break that silence. What he revealed wasn't explosive in volume, but in weight. He spoke of tensions with Jeff Baxter, of battles fought behind the curtain of success, of a friendship that withered under the glare of fame. He didn't lash out, didn't indulge in bitterness, but he acknowledged what fans had long suspected. The Doobie Brothers' triumphs were shadowed by rivalries that nearly tore them apart. His words reframed the story. To the outside world, the band's history had been one of seamless evolution, from biker bar rockers to polished pop icons. But McDonald's truth revealed that the transformation came at a cost. The smooth harmonies that won Grammys were built on compromises and sacrifices, and the silence between him and Baxter was as much a part of the music as the notes they played. By breaking his silence, McDonald didn't just tell his side of the story. He redefined the legacy of the Doobie Brothers. For fans, it was both revelation and reckoning. The songs still shine, the albums still matter, but now they carry new weight. Behind every hit lies a hidden history, and behind every harmony, a fracture. After 50 years, McDonald's confession turned whispers into truth. And once spoken, that truth could never be forgotten. Time has a way of softening memories, of blurring sharp edges into something almost bittersweet. For Michael McDonald and Jeff Baxter, the story didn't end in explosive fights or public takedowns. It ended in distance, silence, and a legacy too big to ignore. The Doobie Brothers' music became timeless, spinning endlessly on radio stations, streaming platforms, and turntables across generations. And yet, behind those familiar notes, the quiet fracture between two men remained. At 73, McDonald has reached a point where the past no longer needs to be hidden. His words about Baxter weren't designed to stir controversy, but to set the record straight. After all, when history is left untold, it risks being rewritten by those who weren't there. McDonald's honesty forces us to re-examine the Doobie Brothers not as a flawless brotherhood, but as a band that endured the same rivalries, jealousies, and bruised egos that haunt every great group. And that's what makes their story so powerful. Out of tension came brilliance. Out of rivalry came reinvention. Out of silence came songs that still define moments of joy, heartbreak, and love for millions around the world. Without Baxter's fire, the Doobies might never have had their raw edge. Without McDonald's smooth soul, they might never have reached the mainstream heights that secured their place in history. Together, even divided, they created something greater than themselves. Now, as McDonald reflects, the bitterness seems smaller than the music. The wounds may never fully heal, but the songs remain eternal. That's the paradox of legacy. It isn't built on harmony alone, but on conflict that somehow gives birth to beauty. Fans don't just hear the music. They feel the battles, the sacrifices, the truths finally spoken after decades of silence. In the end, Michael McDonald's voice carries more than melody. It carries history. And Jeff Baxter's guitar carries more than riffs. It carries rebellion. They may have stood on opposite ends of the stage, but together they defined an era. 50 years later, the silence is broken, the truth revealed, and the legacy stronger than ever. Because while men grow old, while friendships fracture, while silence lingers, music, if it's powerful enough, refuses to fade. If harmony hides dissonance, do we celebrate the music or question the silence between the notes? At 73, Michael McDonald finally speaks of Jeff Baxter. But what he reveals depends on how closely we're willing to listen. Before memory fades and legends harden into myth, remember, the truth of a band is rarely the same as the story it tells. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.